Fabulous. So welcome to Acquisition for CLTs, and this is an Ask an Expert session. My name is Celia Wandio. I'm the CLT specialist with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. And two of my colleagues are here tonight, Dominique and Jane, helping me out. This session is kind of a companion session to one last week that was delivered by Dominique. That was kind of key considerations for acquisition, specifically for board members of CLTs. And if you were not there or you weren't registered, oh, there she is in the background. If you weren't registered, we can send out the slides. You can send me an email and I'll send you the slides. And the slides and the recording will both be available on our website soon if you missed that. It was a really good session. So this session, I'm just going to do a short presentation, not going to take too much time. Just talking about some further kind of considerations for acquisition. And then we're going to get into a Q&A, and most of the time will be taken up by just, you asking your questions about acquisition to our panel of experts, Tiffany, Sean, and Josh, who I'll introduce properly shortly. So we always start with our statement of solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And so, the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts works on the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across so-called Canada. And we're engaging in land-based practices on stolen land. So as a result, it's really important that we support Indigenous sovereignty and well-being through tangible actions. So some of the things that we're doing are supporting the development and growth of Indigenous-led CLTs, documenting best practices for supporting reconciliation, decolonization, and land back through CLTs, and developing resources to support non-Indigenous CLTs in solidarity efforts. And this is really important for a session like this, when we're talking about acquisition and thinking about, what it means to acquire land that was stolen, and how do we ensure that acquisition programs and strategies are responsive to the housing needs of Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led CLTs. I want to add, I'm calling in from Tikaronto or Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I encourage you all to put in an acknowledgement of the land that you're currently on in the chat if you're elsewhere. And of course, you probably all know a little bit about us, the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. I think I recognize just about every name here, but just to let you know in case you don't, we are a nonprofit and our goal is to support the growth of community land trusts, with the primary purpose of helping them acquire, develop, and steward permanently affordable housing, land, and other assets that contribute to a thriving community. And we do that in three main ways. One is through knowledge mobilization. So that's things like this session, other sessions, resources that we provide on our website. We also do direct technical assistance, so working directly with CLTs to help them, with organizational development, with projects to get them moving. And we also do movement building and advocacy. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the advocacy work that we're trying to support later on. So typical housekeeping, of course, everyone knows, stay muted when you're not talking. You can put questions in the chat at any time. I will probably ignore questions just for the beginning presentation piece, just so we can get through that and get to a proper Q&A. But feel free, as you think of questions, to put them in the chat. And we'll get to them when we get into the Q&A. You can have your camera on or off. I do love when some people keep their cameras on just so I have faces to look at, but that's hypocritical of me to say because I basically always have my camera off if I'm not actively engaging in a meeting, so you do you. The session will be recorded. It's being recorded now, including the questions piece. So I do encourage you in the Q&A, maybe don't share like really sensitive information about your organization or yourself. But of course, if anything like that does come up, we'll cut it out of the recording before sharing it publicly. So just a heads up there. And slides and resources will be sent to you all afterwards, along with a feedback form just about this session and last week's session, because we'd love to hear your thoughts. So we're going to be just for the first little bit, I'll be talking, but not for very long because Dominique last week did a great job of covering key considerations for acquisition. So I'm just going to talk about a few things that I think will help, spark some questions for our Q&A and for discussion. So I'm going to talk about, defining what are we talking about when we talk about acquisition, and then a few things around capacity funding and land for acquisition. That'll just be about 10-15 minutes, then we'll get into our Ask an Expert Q&A. So again, as I'm talking, I encourage you to jot down either in the chat or just for yourself questions related to your own organization and your plans for acquisition. And we'll then have a lot of time to kind of go back and forth with our panel and amongst ourselves and discuss. So I love being super clear about terms when we use them. And one thing that I've noticed is that the housing sector has started using the word acquisition as shorthand, which is completely fine and good as long as we all know what we're talking about. But then the word acquisition means a lot of different things actually. In this context, what we're primarily talking about, although there's a lot of overlap, is the purchase of buildings currently in private ownership that usually contain residential units, typically tenanted rental units, by nonprofits for the purpose of preserving or increasing affordability. So, this conversation about acquisition is really coming out of a specific context, which is, advocacy and policy around the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing and a recognition of the need to protect that housing. And, in some cases, CLTs have kind of become synonymous with this strategy of acquisition, but it's not a growth strategy that all CLTs can or will employ, and that's also completely fine. It's just kind of one piece of the puzzle for some CLTs. And, I'm specifying residential buildings here. That doesn't mean that a lot of what we're talking about won't also be applicable for groups that are looking to acquire existing buildings for non-residential uses like community spaces or commercial units. A lot of this will also be applicable when it comes to acquiring land for new development or agricultural land, or those looking to acquire and preserve existing non-market housing assets like co-ops or public housing units. And that's something that I know both Tiffany and Josh can speak to as well. But all of these.
Julia, I'm still looking at the first slide, the outline. I don't know if that.
Oh. What, is everyone seeing the outline, or are you seeing?
Yes, it's still in the outline slide.
Oh, weird. Okay. What's going on there? Thank you. It must have frozen. Oh, okay, let me stop sharing. Thank you for letting me know. Apologies, folks. Try this again. Okay. All right. So I think, yes. Thank you. This was the one slide that we missed, and then I'm on this slide now. And I think I spoke through pretty much all the text here, so you didn't miss too much, but I'll also send out these slides afterwards. Thanks for the heads up. Let me know if that happens again. I don't know what's going on there. All right, so where was I? Yeah, so I was just saying we're not talking about these things. Like, a lot of these things are also, related, and there are similar considerations and areas of knowledge and strategies. But in this context, when we say acquisition, we're primarily talking about the acquisition of existing, residential buildings. And we at CNCLT do want to create resources on these other topics, but this is kind of where there's been a lot of demand from our members so far. But, if you have specific areas of interest in these other kind of bubbles, do let us know, because we're always trying to increase our library of resources. Let me make sure you're seeing this next slide, right? You should be seeing the three-legged stool. Everyone seeing that? Fabulous. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I want to get into just briefly some considerations when approaching acquisition projects. And here I'm borrowing the idea of the three-legged stool from our friends at CADCO in Ottawa. The idea is basically that any large housing project is a three-legged stool that cannot stand if you're missing even just one leg. And those legs are capital, land, and capacity. And I'll briefly talk about each with reference to acquisition of existing rental buildings. So the first kind of question that you should be asking yourself when you are approaching an acquisition project is, do you have the capacity to do it? Last week, Dominique focused on the role of the board in acquisition and what the board needs to know. So I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the role of staff and consultants. So basically what we've seen from our members is that it's going to be very difficult to pull off an acquisition project if you aren't already a staffed CLT. Oh, let me just close my email because I'm getting noises. All right. Yeah, it's going to be very hard to take on an acquisition project if you don't have staff working for your CLT. And this is probably the case even if you have a consultant doing a lot of the project work. Now, there's no definites here, but just generally, these projects take a lot of time and kind of focused attention. It's also going to be key to have internal capacity to manage the buildings once you've acquired them. The great and also, on the next slide, sorry. The great and also tricky thing about acquisition projects versus development is that there's a kind of shorter runway between when you start the project and the project close than there is with a new development, which might be like years, which means that once you start, you should already have a pretty clear idea of how you're going to be operating the building and making sure that you have the capacity to do that. This is true even if you're going to be partnering with and leasing to an experienced housing operator. You're still going to need someone responsible for managing the CLT's governance, your further growth, capital repairs, engagement with the community, working with and supporting your partner organization, etc. But of course, just getting staff is not necessarily that simple. Hiring staff as a new CLT takes money. And this is kind of a big question mark for a lot of early stage CLTs. Where does that funding come from? What you're probably going to need to do is do some form of business planning early on to ensure that you can hire staff in a way that is sustainable. So you need to be figuring out where that money is coming from, whether it's going to be possible to make it work from building revenues, which is unlikely at first, or if you're going to need to rely on grants or donations and figure out where those might be coming from. Another consideration is whether you want to project manage the acquisition yourself, as staff with the CLT, or if you want to hire a consultant. Josh can definitely speak more to this, but he told me that Parkdale found it helpful to hire a consultant for their first major acquisition project and then use that as a capacity building exercise for the organization. So that's something to consider. But it's, I know some have done it, but it's going to be quite tricky if you haven't done these projects before to lead an acquisition all by yourself. You're probably going to need some form of external support. And a final consideration in capacity is that you'll want to plan ahead for busy times in the acquisition process. So this is just a kind of timeline of a typical acquisition. And, all of it is probably going to be fairly busy. But basically, you need to especially plan to have all hands on deck during the due diligence period, the closing period, and immediately after the closing period when you get full possession of the property. So, whether you have staff or whether you have a working board or whatever it might be, you need to make sure that you're going to have the capacity to really be focused on the project during these periods. So the second question is about land, and it's, do you know what you're looking for? And so, I think a lot of this was covered in Dominique's presentation, but things to consider are kind of where the needs, the land-based needs are meeting opportunities existing in your community. So to understand what those needs are, it's helpful to do research and engagement with the broader community to figure out what the needs are and what the priorities should be. And then understanding the opportunities means understanding the state of the market or submarket that you're looking into, likely working with a realtor to understand what's out there and what market conditions might be influencing your opportunities. And the big thing that you need to ask yourself is, are you going to be able to move fast enough to seize on a promising opportunity when it arises? So that means having capacity in place, having policies and processes in place, so that you don't have to kind of go back and forth when you're in a kind of tight turnaround to make an offer and do due diligence. You want to have those things as set as possible. There are going to be things that you'll have to figure out on the fly or adjust, but you want to have thought about at least all aspects of the process going into it. And another question related to that is, does acquisition of existing buildings make sense for your CLT? And I wanted to raise this because I think as people talk more about acquisition and in the same breath as talking about CLTs, some CLTs think that this has to be our main growth strategy, and that's not the case. It might not make sense in the context of your community. Some CLTs that are kind of focused more in rural areas might find that there just aren't buildings worth acquiring for them, and they actually need to focus on developing new. You also might find, even if you're in an urban area, that if you're serving a specific population, you want to be able to develop buildings to the specifications of the needs of that population. So I just wanted to flag this as like acquisition is a promising strategy for a lot of CLTs and other nonprofits, but it's not the only way. And then the final leg of the stool is, do you have the funding? And I wanted to just get in a bit more to public acquisition funding that exists. We're working on a resource that kind of summarizes all of this that will be published soon. So keep an eye out for that. But basically, there's been an increasing number of public programs that are providing funding for acquisition. But they really vary a lot in terms of the form of support and kind of the way that the program is structured. So in the province of Nova Scotia has repayable loans. The province of Quebec has temporary loans. The province of British Columbia, through their rental protection fund, provides grants. And then at the municipal level, the Halifax Regional Municipality has a kind of broader grant program for affordable housing, and acquisition is an eligible activity under that, and that's through a grant. The City of Toronto has their multi-unit residential acquisition program, which is a forgivable loan. And in theory, there is a federal program that, the details are still to be announced, but that is expected to be a mix of loans and grants. But what do you do if you're in an area that is not covered by any of these? And of course, when there's federal funding, anyone in Canada will be, in theory, eligible for the federal program. But until then, what else, what other forms of funding can you access, or what forms of funding can you stack with those funding programs? So there's a number that CLTs and other groups have been using. One is a line of credit, so like a temporary financing solution to enable you to act quickly and buy a building, and then you can convert that financing to a longer term mortgage. That's what's available through Van City Investment Bank's Preserve and Protect program, and a number of CLTs have used that. Of course, you can get a traditional mortgage. The problem there is just that getting that financing in place can take some time and a lot of back and forth, and that doesn't always work when you're trying to acquire a property that's for sale on the market, which is why often the kind of short-term financing happens first. A number of CLTs have been using community bonds to support their acquisition programs, and we've got Dominique from Kensington Market CLT, and I think still Mike from Ottawa maybe has left, maybe still is here. Yes, there he is. Both have community bond raises that they'll be using for acquisition, and basically that gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of being able to seize on good opportunities for acquisition. CLTs can also access other forms of investment if they can get them, and then donations or grants can help supplement this, but in most cases that hasn't been a significant help, I think, for most CLTs. It's like a smaller piece of the overall capital stack. And the last thing I want to say on this is related to this question of, is there public funding for acquisition in your area? We've been working with the Ontario Nonprofit Network. They put together a really fantastic advocacy toolkit to help groups in Ontario advocate for an Ontario Housing Acquisition Fund. And so if you're a group in Ontario, we encourage you to look at their page and take action in terms of contacting your MPP, submitting a pre-budget submission, and other things that they list on their site. And if you're not in Ontario, we encourage you to look at their resources because they have some really great things in terms of like talking points and draft letters. And you can take pieces of what they've produced to help with advocacy in your area. I'll share that in the chat, or maybe, I don't know if someone else has, I'll share it in the chat afterwards. All right, and that ends the section of this where it is me talking. I'm just going to quickly introduce our fantastic panel of experts, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So first, we've got Joshua Barndt, who up until very recently was the executive director of the Neighbourhood Land Trust from 2015 until, I guess, just last month. And he's now the senior manager of development strategy. Josh led PNLT through the acquisition of 2 privately owned rental buildings, as well as over 80 Toronto community housing properties. He was also, quite influential in getting the multi-unit residential acquisition program here in Toronto. And he's also the person who taught me basically everything that I know about acquisition. Then we've got Sean Campbell. Sean is the executive director of the Union Co-operative. And he's also the principal of Scaled Purpose, which is a management consultancy for nonprofits, charities, and co-ops. He led Union Co-op through the acquisition of 2 apartment buildings with a total of, I think, 58 units, which was a couple years ago. And he's also a brilliant thinker when it comes to long-term protection of assets and creative ways of financing projects. So I encourage you to pick his brains on that. And last but not least, we've got Tiffany Duzita. Tiffany is the executive director of CHFBC's Community Land Trust. She's been with CLTBC through all of its kind of massive growth since 2015, first as, I think, director of development and now as ED. And they've done a massive amount of work acquiring and helping preserve existing co-ops, as well as developing new affordable housing. And she's extremely knowledgeable about BC's rental protection fund and just generally about, real estate processes, acquisition and development. So we've got a really fantastic group of 3 people here. I'm gonna ask you folks if you can just say, a couple words about who you are and your background, just before we open it up to broader questions. And maybe I'll start with Josh, just in terms of going alphabetically.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. Thanks for the great introduction and introducing the topic. So I'm a community land trust practitioner. Started as a volunteer, have the great honor and privilege to be able to, work for a community land trust in the community I grew up in and live in Parkdale in Toronto. And in my time in the land trust, a lot of my time has been focused on trying to figure out how to make acquisitions work. Our work in Parkdale started back in 2014. The community knew that we needed to try to preserve the existing rental housing that we had, and created a community land trust to be a part of that solution. When I came on board as staff, we decided to start with looking at the crisis of rooming house loss. Parkdale is a neighborhood in Toronto which has the most density of rooming houses of any other part of the city. And this is the most affordable rental housing in the private market. And it was a type of housing that had kind of, there was like a big policy gap in terms, like, no one really cared about preserving rooming houses. The city was happy to see them upscaled. And there was a lot of investors interested in buying and upscaling those buildings. So we worked with tenants to sort of map out what their crisis really looked like. And we found just under 200 rooming houses, double as many as the city were aware of. We identified sort of like the market dynamics in the rooming house market, and worked with tenants to name some potential solutions, one of which was for the land trust and other nonprofits to take ownership and operation of some of the private rooming houses that were being sold off by historic landlords. And we were going to purchase the buildings instead of investor groups purchasing them and upscaling them. And we were going to purchase them so we could keep them affordable. And we spent years failing. And it took us a lot of struggle to finally develop a partnership with the city, find the right consultants to support us, get the right amount of funding to make a project work, and build our own capacity and confidence to do that. And we did our first acquisition in 2019. And today in 2024, we own 86 buildings and 206 rental units. So, acquisitions where we started, and now we do a lot more. But I'm very passionate about acquisitions. I look forward to talking in detail about the things that we've learned over the years on how to make acquisitions work and how to think about it. But maybe the thing I'll say first is the way to learn how to the best way to learn how to do an acquisition is to do an acquisition, or to try to do an acquisition. We had just under 20 failed acquisitions before our first successful acquisition, and while it was a really depressing, hard struggle, we learned so much each time. Each failure was like a great opportunity to learn. And we used our failures to just put more pressure on the public sector to support us and donors to support us. And I think we're in just a really special moment where there's real support for acquisition, and we just need to go out and do it well. Make sure we're buying good buildings and setting these buildings up for success in the future.
I'm muted. Amazing. Thank you so much, Josh. Sean, do you mind saying a couple words so people know a bit more about you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me and for organizing this event today. I have so much respect for the other folks up here that are sharing, and definitely Parkdale and Josh were part of the reason that we thought, this crazy idea is something we can pull off in the Loire region. So thanks for leading the way there too. I think for us, trying a few acquisitions was definitely part of learning. Speaking with so many other folks who were just further ahead than us, failing in certain low risk ways as well. You can't fail with a full acquisition because that's really expensive, but trying and putting in a bid and seeing when someone says no and what they push back on is really interesting. Having your partners in place, who's going to do all your studies, who your bank is, what your bank wants to see from you, really understanding how you fit within their needs and can be a great partner for the bank and for CMHC, I think is a really critical part of this work. But it's so rewarding when you get to move forward and actually help people preserve their homes. And it's also heartbreaking when you look at homes and you know that you can't save them. And that could be because you just don't have enough money at the time. Could be because there's no grant funding in most areas in Canada to support this work. So, one of the first properties we looked at, the very first one, we had a purchase agreement signed for 18 units, and there was a woman who had lived in that building for 40 years. She raised her daughter in the building, and her daughter was now raising her granddaughter in the floor above. We weren't able to figure ourselves out quickly enough. If this happened today, we would have bought the building, but we didn't know what we were doing then. We lost it. And since then it's flipped at least one more time, no work being done on it, just the price has just increased. And to see the type of pressure on folks like that, I think although there's a lot of great incentives and pressure to build new, we have to really think about the people who already call these places home. They're so much more affordable than a lot of the newer buildings that are coming out. But everyone should have the right to stay in their home and their community as long as they can and want to. So this is one more tool in our community's tool chest to try and make sure that everyone's being respected and able to fully participate in their own community. So we've experimented with a few different ways of doing this in the region. It's gotten harder, not easier, unfortunately, for us, just as prices have kind of moved around and rents have moved around. And now we're looking at ways that we can cross subsidize and internally to make some of these buildings that are really cheap or have really low rents still make the math work, even though otherwise it wouldn't.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean. And Tiffany.
Yeah, and so welcome everybody and joining from I guess all across the country tonight. Yeah, Community Land Trust. So we're located out in Vancouver in British Columbia, and we've had a long journey of acquisitions. It's actually, I first started with the organization in 2015, and although I think a tendency, a lot of what we kind of celebrate here in BC are our new builds, we don't often talk about what we're preserving. And Community Land Trust, actually, one of our first projects when I came on board was actually an acquisition. It wasn't privately held, but it was a co-op property that we were able to preserve that was going through bankruptcy, but it's Bakerview Housing Co-op, and we call it the property that keeps on giving. One of these things that we learned 7 years later is that when you own these assets, how are you able to leverage these assets to do more, whether that's building your capacity or actually refinancing, to exactly what Sean, you were saying, is how do you use that portfolio to bring in money to put it to other properties where it's most needed. But that really kind of sparked our journey over the past 7 years. We've been able to preserve 1,041 homes here in BC. One of those properties has infill opportunity to add another 300 homes as well. And these are all co-op homes. We're owned by the cooperative housing sector, so that's our focus. But speaking specifically on those that would be at risk that are owned by the private sector in the past 2 years, we have been able to secure out of those 1,000+ homes, 715 of them were on privately held land that were leased by housing co-ops through the old federal programs back in the 80s. And those leases did expire or were expiring. Were either marketed or not marketed or marketed again to the private sector. But 4 properties in Burnaby and Coquitlam. And with our most recent acquisition included in that, which was the 290 homes out in Coquitlam, that of course the Rental Protection Fund was a big contributor to that, to make that successful for us to preserve it. But just like others have said, like we've had to throw many things at the board to see what sticks. We've gone from traditional financing to social purpose equity financing, our own equity into these projects, working with housing co-ops of how to repurpose their replacement reserves as equity into the acquisition as well. And also one of the funding things that I would encourage people to look at that you may not be so obvious is that talk to your local government where these buildings are located. We've had great success of about 35 million coming into our acquisitions from local government, because they have an investment in those homes in their communities too. So I say, if you don't ask, you don't know. So think outside the box as well. What you might look at for access to funding that might not be a prescribed program, but you could have some advocates in your local government that have coffers to put to good use for housing. So welcome everybody and look forward to having an engaging dialogue this evening.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Wow, that's a great start. I learned so much every time all of you speak. So we've got one question in the chat already, so we'll start there, but I encourage everybody to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll get to you. So the first question we've got is directed at Josh, specifically from Michelle. I guess maybe this is a request to chat more, but maybe you can speak to how you did the research and established a working relationship with the city when it comes to rooming houses.
Yeah, Thanks for the question. I'll share in the chat after I speak a link to a report that we published about 2 months ago on our experience building a relationship with the City of Toronto, which has become our most important partnership. I should say, like, to acknowledge that importance of it, none of our projects would have happened without the support of the City of Toronto. They're our primary funder and our biggest partner. But it didn't happen overnight. When the community decided to create a community land trust, even the local councillor, Gord Perks, who's understood in Toronto to be one of the most socialist councillors, thought we were crazy, and thought, like, I didn't believe that the community could buy land in the hot Toronto real estate market. But we fumbled around for years, and we fumbled around in like really like caring, curious, and intentional ways, trying to understand, like, well, how was the housing crisis in Parkdale unfolding? Really, how was it happening? How were people losing their homes? Like, what was going on with those buildings? Like, what was happening in that market? What were people's experiences? What were the landlords' thoughts? Who were the new investors? And then how could the community respond to a crisis as an opportunity? And so that work began with research. Like, we were just community members concerned about the crisis. We all understood that gentrification was happening. We exist in a capitalist real estate market, which seeks to extract profit from land and housing, and low-income, moderate-income people, especially in a community of primarily of renters, are often the victims of that capitalist process of extraction. And so we had a critique of that overall macro process underway, but we actually didn't know enough about what was happening in the submarket. We didn't know how to intervene. So we thought, like, why don't we spend some time researching it? We got some funding from a local donor who we kind of said, we'd like to learn more about rooming house loss and the evictions that we all know are happening. We got some funding from the Maitrey Foundation, a local foundation, who's interested in the issue of human rights. And we said, this is an issue of housing as a human right. Rooming house tenants deserve a home and the protections for their homes. And we want to explore how we could, better protect the housing for this particular vulnerable population. And so we took the money, we hired a planner for 6 months, and we hired 6 rooming house tenants. And so that team of 6 rooming house tenants and a planner, like, went door to door to every building in the community. And we did that to sort of determine, like, which buildings were or weren't rooming houses. We spoke to tenants and we spoke to landlords. And so through that process, we were able to map all of the rooming houses, but also learn about what was happening, about what the landlords were thinking, why they were selling their buildings, what their considerations were, who they were imagining selling their buildings to, why, and what the experience of tenants were. And so, like, doing that work and specifically doing it with tenants, like, the picture just became more and more clear, and the complexity of the issue became more and more clear. Taking that time, like, allowed us to understand the submarket, for one, understand the interests of the landlords, the people who are currently in control of the housing, understand the needs of the tenants who we, as an organization, we wanted to work with to support, them having access to their housing on a long-term basis. And then also understand what the city's role was in all of that. So we were able to also identify policy gaps in the city's policy frameworks that left rooming houses as extremely vulnerable to closure, upscaling, et cetera. Rooming house tenants having less rights than other tenants due to particular policy gaps. Yeah, so we published a report, and then that report sort of like highlighted all that the new information that we had about the state of that submarket stock. We framed it in a way that community members could understand as a crisis that needed an emergency response. We brought together the other partners in the community who we thought could support a response. So that included other supportive housing and affordable housing providers, the legal clinic, the City of Toronto, not just the city as like a master entity, but all the departments that were relevant: municipal licensing and standards, the housing secretariat, city legal. You know, we told all these departments that this issue is relevant to them and they needed to be a part of the discussions around solutions. And we said, like, you know, we were a tiny community group at Community Land Trust, but we said there needs to be a neighborhood-wide response. Everyone needs to be involved. All these organizations are implicated. The city is implicated, and we're going to take on trying to figure out a model to bring some of the properties into nonprofit ownership. And we proposed that for a few reasons. One is that we were able to identify that in this submarket, the landlords, the historic landlords, were actually providing affordable rental housing in the private sector. You know, sometimes the quality of housing was kind of low. Sometimes the landlords took a, you know, managed in unethical ways, but it was affordable rental housing. They were, this like group of landlords were generally coming to retirement age, and their children or heirs were not interested in running rooming houses. And so they were liquidating the assets and seeking to generate a profit. And so we knew that was happening. And in the current market, the only actors that are generally buying multi-unit rental housing in Toronto or have the equity for that are investor groups or REITs. And so these properties were going to be repositioned if they were sold. So we could tell everyone that if there's not a nonprofit solution, when a sale occurs, we're almost guaranteed to see these buildings slowly emptied out of their low-income tenants. And those people, there's a high chance that those individuals could become homeless if they can't access other forms of affordable rental housing, which we know are at short supply in Toronto. So we were able to present the situations, the crisis that needed response. We understood the situation and all the actors, and we used that information to mobilize those actors to take action. The legal clinic took action to actually begin to organize rooming house tenants and support them to set up tenant committees so they could defend their tenancies as buildings were turning over. We knew we couldn't act and buy all the buildings, and we worked with the city government to eventually create a funding program that would support us to acquire those buildings. I think I've spoken for a long time, so I'll probably stop. And if you have a follow-up question, please feel free. The work is well documented. If you go to our website, I'll post the reports, but it's well documented there. But maybe I'll end by just saying that I personally believe that community-based research is an extremely powerful organizing tool. When you work with community members who are impacted by a housing issue to explore what's happening on the ground and try to link their experiences to what's happening in the market, and you're able to see that full picture and have that discussion, that mature discussion between like tenants with lived experience, housing experts, city government, I think we have the ingredients to take action. And it's very hard for city government or other levels of government or lenders, et cetera, to not get on board. I think it just makes sense when we can present it with that, from that robust storytelling perspective with data behind it, and tenants, telling their stories. So it's real. It's not just, oh, people might become homeless. Like Jim is here today to tell us about his experience, as well. So I just want to emphasize that I think it's one of the most powerful tools we have at our disposal, and we can do it. The community can do it. We have people in our community who have that experience and can do that. And for us, it opened up. It was the groundwork that made all the other work we've done since possible. And the other thing I should say is tenants from those who supported, who were part of that research study, have stayed involved, and some live in our buildings, and some have been on our board at different moments and participate in other ways. So it's also doing research with community members and getting out there and doing that work is also a way to meet the people who will actually be core to the work that you do in the long run, to make sure that you fulfill the mandate to the community.
Thanks so much, Josh. Sean and Tiffany, I wonder if you have any thoughts to share on information gathering research that you did to prepare your organizations for acquisition. If you have any thoughts on that.
And yeah, I'll just chime in. Ours is actually pretty simple. Mainly because of our mandate and ownership under the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC. So, you know, one of our main criteria is when we were looking at it is it as a housing co-op that could be lost. Most of our stuff starts there. So we're a little bit unique with regards to that. But I would also just echo, like, even what Josh was talking about there, and his whole process, it's pretty similar across every acquisition. But I love what Josh was saying with regards to, like, don't underestimate the power of the community voice. It is key, like, even for us with our co-op members and the stories that they have to tell. And sometimes it just takes, like, starting those conversations and growing the conversations to make those communities and the broader community aware of the importance of what you're trying to do. And don't worry that how big or how small it is. Everything that you do try to tackle makes a difference. But it's, you know, I always say whether it's 1 unit or 100 homes you're saving, it's the same amount of work, unfortunately. But like I say, our experience, besides going through the technical aspect of an acquisition, you know, when you talked about those 3 legs of the stool, you know, our main focus has really been on housing co-ops. And that's kind of what has kind of made us unique as well, in this space.
Amazing, thank you. Sean,
And
yeah.
although you may not, you know, 1 unit or 100, it means everything to that one person in that 1 unit if their home is preserved. So yeah, go big and be bold, but also be super proud and happy if you pull off something a little bit smaller than what you planned to. It still means everything to them. For us, a lot of it was trying to build our own capacity internally. None of us, we were all kind of the usual nonprofit suspects in different ways working in our community. So we knew that we could organize and you know, get community projects going, but none of us really knew anything about real estate. So a lot of it was, you know, reading of different policy documents and trying to come up with spreadsheets and thinking about, you know, Residential Tenancy Act rules and how all that would work after. And so that took some time, and that was part of, you know, why a few of our first attempts at purchasing didn't work out, was we just weren't all there. So if anyone is on the call here just getting started, I'm happy to share some of our spreadsheets and other documents too, if that helps speed up your journey. There's no point of going through all the same bumps along the road that we did if it can be a quicker journey for you. On the research side, you know, some of what we did after we purchased the building, and so this is something else too, is, you know, when we were getting started, there wasn't a whole lot of attention from our area municipality. So we have multiple municipalities in the area. There's just so many different people, nonprofits and charities working on affordable housing, and their focus was more on, the municipalities were focusing on people who are chronically homeless, which is wonderful and is needed and makes sense. But this type of housing fitting between the work of charities in the market wasn't really a priority or a focus. And because of that, we had a hard time getting a lot of attention from the municipalities. We had lots of great attention from the community. So actually, after we purchased the property, that really started to change things. So we started to be able to have a lot of different conversations with senior leaders at municipalities who were being invited to conversations we weren't invited to before. Like, suddenly we weren't just a bunch of wacky community folks who were wacky community folks who owned something. So that was helpful. So another, you know, kind of encouragement that, like, do your planning and your due diligence before you get going, but also make sure you get going, because it is going to really help you do what comes next. So we started right before we purchased the building, and this is also kind of a response to Sarah's question. We closed on our property in October of 2022. In July, we went to council to ask for a property tax exemption. We had found this tool in the Municipal Act that says any council can exempt any affordable housing property of property taxes. Most don't. Ours didn't seem to really know that they have that power. Council directed staff to get back to them, and 2 years later, the bylaw was passed. So now we have our regional government and 2 of our 3 lower tier cities, none of our townships yet, who have passed this bylaw. We're now 6 months into negotiating the agreement of what the agreement looks like between ourselves and the region. So, give yourselves lots of time on this as well. We also spent a couple of years building relationships with charitable foundations so that, they weren't surprised when we came and we said, all right, there's an opportunity on the market. We need $1 million in 60 days. Can you give us a commitment in 30 to 60 days that you've got $1 million for us? So that was another piece that it took a long time. And part of that was us working in the nonprofit and charitable world, that there was that level of trust. So that's really important too. So we were able to get the tax policy through. And again, anyone in Ontario, happy to share with you our research on that and the resulting policy. For an 80 unit property we're looking at right now, a 60% property tax reduction will save us about $2.25 million in equity that we don't have to raise because we can take on more bank debt. So, really huge. A $90,000 property savings is the same as, a $2 million grant. So that's a big deal. The next piece that we're starting to work on, which is a little more community research focused, is, there's a lot of energy around landlord licensing right now, which is wonderful. But maybe not a lot of specifics about what that is. So we're asking ourselves the question of, how do we move from being what we legally are as a landlord to the more aspirational housing provider? And with that, we're bringing together community legal, different housing representatives, tenants themselves, including our tenants, to say, from the very first time an ad is posted to the walkthrough, to signing the lease, to the time that you miss that rent payment, to a conflict with your neighbor, to when you move out, what are all the guardrails in place, the interactions with landlords, and where do people, kind of fall through some of the cracks in our system too? So we're looking at creating our own donor advised fund that can help as an emergency rent bank when our public rent banks don't work for tenants in really unique situations. But, where else can we get creative on that and hopefully bring others forward? So we've seen, different faith organizations have wanted to make donations. They don't necessarily have enough money for capital campaign donations, but they love the idea of supporting a rent bank, of even supporting Duca Credit Union in Ontario right now. It just has a new program where they're helping low-income folks refinance payday loans and things like that. Could we put $20,000 in a GIC to act as an offset? So if any of our tenants are in these really extractive loans, we can help buy down their debt. Hopefully that means they can pay us on time, but also just helps them get out of that process too. So beyond just being a landlord, how do we create community infrastructure as a result of us owning this asset and having this permanent stake and position in our community?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sean. Yeah, I see that Josh has his hand up.
Love the rent bank stuff. I honestly, like, we came across the rent bank. We created a rent relief fund during the pandemic and just past the pandemic. Not because, not for the obvious reasons, but because we found that there were some tenants in buildings that we were taking over where we were the new landlord, that the tenants couldn't pay rent and weren't comfortable coming and telling, staff. And people would leave overnight, get behind on rent and leave overnight. And it was like the worst failure. We felt like, oh God, like we're here, like we're doing this so people can keep their housing. And the fact that people don't feel comfortable to come and, let you know that they can't pay rent, they're not going to be able to catch up, they don't know how they're going to catch up, was a huge failure for us. And so we're like, we have to have a formal way for people to have a path to having some rent relief and to be able to say, honestly, I can't pay and I need some help for a bit. And, for there to be an actual like communication between the land trust or our housing partners and the tenant, so that relationship can be built where we know that we're here to support, but also, rent is important because we need to keep these buildings running. So there has to be money to replace the rent temporarily. And then there needs to be a plan to get back to a place where people can pay rent. So, but having that, we did it as a way to open up the opportunity for communication trust building. And it was made possible also through a donor. I want to go back to the question though on when do you talk to the city for acquisition funding? And it's a great question. Like through our experience, I have a different answer now than I would have had a long time ago, I think. we went immediately and asked for funding back in the day, but people didn't, the city didn't have confidence we could act. It took quite a while for them to build confidence in us. So I don't know like when the best time to first ask is. I don't know what we could have done to like come with a more confident pitch or like a better pitch. But one thing we learned is that it's really hard to have a successful acquisition if you start that acquisition not knowing where the money's coming from. So what I say to people today is, don't try to buy something unless you have the money. And it's frustrating if you're in a context where you don't have the money, of course. So our experience was that we actually had to spend a few years, convincing the city to make money available before we could have a successful acquisition. And then when their money ran out and there wasn't a program yet that would be ongoing, we had to convince private investors to give us that money before we could have our second successful acquisition. Now there's a city program, and every year we could have a successful acquisition if we do the right things to find the right building and put a good application to the city. So my main piece of advice is to actually have a concrete conversation with the city about their ability to support a potential project. To try, our initial approach was to say like, would you fund a pilot? Maybe you're not ready for a program, but how would you fund a pilot? Once there's a commitment to do a pilot and there's funding, then you can try to do an acquisition. And then if this pilot goes well, would they be willing to create a program? But my advice would be, it's really, really not ideal. I would hope that no one would have to do exactly what we did, which is have 19 or whatever it was. I don't know the exact number, but failed acquisitions. Like, we never should have tried to buy buildings without money. We would get an agreement of purchase and sale, meet the tenants, develop relationships, and then go take a business plan to the city and say, we need the money, and take the business plan to foundations and donors. We need the money by next Monday, 3 weeks from now. And like, there's urgency. These people are going to lose their housing. And then you can't get that money. And then you can't save that housing. And you've built up people's expectations that you're going to be able to save their housing. And it's extremely depressing for everyone. And the consequences are significant and real. So it's, we should only be acting when we know we have a line on the money. And the conversations with the city should be about that. We want to act. We have an interest. We have capacity. What we need is commitments from you to make the money available. Once you can do that, we're going to act. But we don't want to, we actually don't want to cause harm and while we try to, save this housing. We want to act when we know we can act, and we need your support. So I think have that conversation, but I would advise that you try to get a commitment before you try to buy something, because it's a recipe for the failures we had to act without the money.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of CLTs, or at least several, have received kind of ad hoc, city funding, even where there isn't a program. So like Ottawa Community Land Trust, maybe, I think Mike is still here again, but got some funding for their first acquisition, and there wasn't an existing kind of program there. And I know that was similar with you guys. So that's kind of a...
Yeah. We were kind of encouraged to like use a crisis as the pressure to make something happen. And I know that is a strategy, but I think it's really dangerous. I think you can use a crisis to start the conversation, but you can't commit to people that you can do it, and you shouldn't take too much action. Like I really think the responsible thing to do is to say the crisis is happening every week in our community. We need a formal response by the city government and the community. The city needs to support it with real money.
Yeah.
And like, can you make that commitment? What do we need to do it? One last thing is, the crazy thing we learned is that the city councilor can just write this motion that like goes to council and gets voted on. And like for years we were like, there's this crisis, Gord, we have to do something. There's this crisis. And then like when he finally is like, okay, I'll do what you're asking. He wrote 3 sentences and took it to council. And we're like, that's all it took, 3 sentences. And now we just write them ourselves. We're like, Gord, will you take this to council? We're not like, here's the problem. Here's like, Gord, will you take these 3 sentences to council? Give the land trust $3 million for this activity. Like, so secret sauce, right? Like a motion that your councilor, your local government can take to the other people to approve and say, hey, would you take this forward and support this? Here's the language.
That's incredible. Yeah, Tiffany.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Josh was saying. Is like, I think as well, you can shoot yourself in the foot if you go into early, of just kind of crying help with the municipality, and really get to know the property, the community that you would be preserving as well, then the need in that community, meaning like the broader need that housing might provide. And you don't have to have your full commitment with your capital stacking there for the purchase, but be pretty confident on your execution, because a municipality is most likely going to be the last to the table unless they already have a funding program already there for acquisitions. Our experience when we've talked to a lot of municipalities, and this isn't, if anybody is from a municipality online tonight, I'm sorry, but most of the reaction from a political level have been that housing is a senior level government responsibility and not a responsibility of local government. So we found that, in our success is that, we're lining up our traditional lending. We're seeking, whether it be provincial funding programs or federal programs as well, and how to act in that stacking, or what we have to put in with our own equity, and then determining what do we still need to actually acquire this building, and then put forward that ask. And just like what Josh says, we work on the briefing document with whoever our champions are that are on council. And you can start to have some of those conversations earlier, like, because you want to know who your champions are on council as well. But we work closely with them to write the background document that will formulate the motion, right? So help them write that motion, because sometimes we've been tripped up where the wording of the motion gets interpreted differently when it goes down to staff. And then we're like, all right, now we got to go back. And there almost has to be an amendment to what they approved before. So sometimes it can be kind of a tricky process, but identify who your champions, once you kind of know you have a solid business case, identify those champions on your council, work with them closely, and help draft that briefing document and that motion to, eventually get to success on that. So, but yeah, definitely kind of agree. Don't go in there right away. Have that sound business case and identify who those champions are, and then start your I guess your political campaign with the local government.
I would also add that it's expensive to not succeed. So you're still paying for, the legal to get your purchase agreement. You're paying for the building condition assessment and environmentals. Just the building condition and like probably around $12,000-13,000 if you do those two. Legal is maybe a couple more on top of that. Your time that went into it as well. So like you're easily looking at $15,000 to not buy a building. I guess the other piece too would be, so we definitely did the same thing with our property tax piece. We wrote out a 15-page memo on here's the legislation, here's how it works, here's the like example pro formas of what it would look like if we had this versus something else. And then it was passed and it was wonderful. And then we got to the next stage of looking at the agreement. And like I said before, we're like 6 months in still of like all this back and forth on, to what degree could we be in default if they don't like how we're operating the building versus, something else. So all these different ways of moving forward. And I think it can be tough for all of us as community advocates, the people who know how important this work is and the housing work, to also, work at the pace of municipalities as well sometimes, and to not maybe get too excited when we're told no, or when we're pushed back on a bit, to recognize that, normally staff do want to make this work, but there's so many different competing pressures that they're working through as well. So, we have to be strategic and kind of slow moving sometimes to meet their pace also. But when it does, it can be huge. So, we're expecting some public land coming up soon for development, and maybe some more down the road as well. That's super helpful. One of the big things that is hard with these acquisitions is if you want to buy a building with really low rents, there's not a whole lot of money you can use to pay back an investor. So for those of us who are looking at community bonds, foundation loans, You need people who are super patient and are willing to not make a whole lot of money back while also taking on a bunch of risk. So, community bonds are typically at the bottom of the pyramid, that they get paid back after the bank, after, whoever else is secured ahead of them. So I guess, depending on how much time we want to focus on that conversation tonight, we all have to be super careful as well, remembering that it's often non-accredited investors, like folks like us, just community folks who really care, who are taking that chance with us. So to be really careful, are we spending their money on potentially buying a property that falls through? Or do we keep that money in escrow in a special savings account where we're only using it when we know that we can go ahead and purchase it? Are we truly being conservative in our estimates so that we know that we can pay people back on time with whatever interest we told them that we would make it for? And importantly, are we protecting the affordable housing? So I think this is another really important piece too, that we've been adding into our agreements, that even if we're wrong on every single front, and we can't ever pay you back your principal, we can't ever pay you back your interest, we're sharing that risk. And you can't kick out the people who are living in that building. You can't steal the building from the community. Instead, let's create some financial penalties for people like me, but let's not punish the tenants because I made a mistake. So, thinking about this really critically as we're getting into more of these unusual finance situations, that we're not kind of getting ahead of our skis here a bit and ultimately going to get ourselves and the community in trouble.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, Josh.
I think since we're talking about risk and things potentially going badly, which is always a possibility, I think it's worth talking just about how each of us, and I wonder if people are interested in this, but like think about risk in advance of a project, because that's your best opportunity, I think, honestly, is like when you're identifying the site, when you're putting a project together, like trying to anticipate the potential risks and make smart decisions. Of course, there's no project with no risk, but there's definitely riskier projects, and there's ways to do a project that can increase risk or lower risk. So like one thing that we made an error on really early is we first wanted to just respond to any crisis. And unfortunately, in our community, there's a lot of housing crises. There's a lot of buildings that come up for sale with tenants who are really concerned about losing their housing if there's a speculative landlord who takes over. And for a while, we were willing to take on any site. We were going to try to buy any site that comes to market and preserve it if there's low-income tenants. And over the years, we've learned quite a bit about some of those buildings that we tried to buy that we weren't successful on. Finding those things, the things out about those buildings later, alluded us to the fact that we would have been in big trouble if we had. It would have been very hard to be able to provide good housing in those buildings, code compliance issues, egress issues, egress being like in Toronto, standard building code requires double egress for multi-unit rental buildings. So a lot of there's a lot of considerations. What we currently look for, I just want to share because I think our ability to fulfill our commitment to tenants it is dependent on us being able to actually take care of the building, keep it open, keep it safe, and keep it in a good state of repair. So the first thing that we look for currently is double egress or a really clear alternative compliance approach that's active in the building or can easily be implemented. Multi-unit buildings, housing individuals who, some who may have mental health addiction issues, at least in our community, are at high risk of having incidents of fire, are also at high risk of being inspected regularly, potentially shut down when there's code compliance issues. And so it's really critical for us. We look for that double egress or for an alternative compliance approach that we really feel confident about. The consultants tell us, no, it is still safe. It's not just a way to pass, but it's actually safe if an incident were to happen. We look for other things like a state of repair that's adequate, that if we couldn't find money to renovate the building, we would be willing to continue to operate it for the next 10 years. We have to, when we're getting funding for acquisition, we're not generally at the same time getting money to fully retrofit the building. That's the next stage activity generally. So we have to be willing to operate the building in its current state of repair, something close to its current state of repair until we can pull together the other funds, and that may take time. And so we, that state of repair has to be adequate for that. We look for units that are adequate size and have adequate light, things like that. And currently we're now also looking for buildings where we think there's a future for these sites. We didn't think of this initially, but now we're like, if we're gonna, we know we can only buy in our biggest dreams, we own 3% of the community. Those sites, it would be ideal if those sites are appropriate for the future housing that our community will need too, right? Not just the housing that exists there today, but they could be repurposed, expanded, etc. So we look for sites that have intensification potential or a good redevelopment potential in the future. So the existing building's good, but also the site could make sense in the future, because if we're going to own this site forever, we have to think about this site forever. So we take those considerations. In addition, the business plan has to work not just for the next 10 years, but for the next 30 years. I've been having a lot of arguments recently with other people running numbers on buildings, and it's like, oh, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Like, who knows what's going to change? I'm like, no, it's only like it's more likely to be worse than we think, than better than we think. So we need to have projections that show things in the black. When I mean, like, not in deficit at a 30-year projection. So being like really rigorous and serious about your financial projections working, and like being as detailed as you can about the assumptions on every single line in that. You can't know everything, but you should try to know as much as you can, and you should explore and be curious, inquisitive about each number in that document that says the project does or doesn't work. I think it'll be a real disservice if we all buy a bunch of buildings and in 10 years we realize we like can't run them. So we have to have cushion, and we have to take that long-term projection seriously. I'll stop now.
Tiffany.
Yeah, I was just going to add in there the risk, and this has been a learning curve for ourselves, but also how we look at, our future acquisitions. And the risk and a lot of the hard work is after you acquire these buildings, especially the older ones, and they can be 40+ years old. And you do need that long-term lens, and you constantly need to be looking at it. There will be things that come up that you didn't even think could happen. And we had this happen at one of our buildings in Burnaby. And in a period of over 2 months, we all of a sudden had, for varying different reasons, all of a sudden had a large number of units that were vacated. It was an older population, so it was a combination of people that couldn't live independently anymore, people that had passed away, and then also people that were just naturally were moving for other opportunities. And we were left with a large vacancy, and yet faced with capital renewal projects that needed to meet covenant requirements for financing as well. And you have to quickly start to look to pivot and value engineer and revisit that, and then run your numbers again and look at, like, if we make this decision today, how does that affect us tomorrow? Vacancy loss can be a killer to your operational performance. And you quickly need to pivot to figure out a way to minimize the vacancy loss. And what we found, though, is that it's not that we couldn't find people that we could immediately put into those homes, is that the conditions of those homes were also, we weren't getting demand of where the member that had moved out was already paying a rent at a certain level. And what was comparable into the market out there is we were seeing the private sector or other nonprofits and groups that were investing capital renewal works into their existing buildings. So people could go to a like for like in a geographic area and get something that was much more renewed versus a unit that was 40 years old with original condition. So, that itself, so we had, I think it was like 20 some odd units over a 2-month period that were all of a sudden vacant. And you also have to think about if you are going to shift where you're going to put your dollars so you can get people back into those homes. Your vacancy loss is also the time period to renovate or refresh those homes to the point where you can get people in. So there is, that was one of our biggest lessons learned as well, is really kind of thinking everything can look good on paper day one, but you're really running the scenarios in your head through past experience on what you've done, and also just throwing things at it, and just, you know, you might be just toggling numbers in the Excel spreadsheet just to test your sensitivities, but test it again, and look at that longer term thing, because nobody has a crystal ball. You don't know how these buildings are going to perform 10, 15 years out. All you know is that you're going to own them, right? And that you're going to be responsible for that. And so you want to have enough flexibility when you put in that original acquisition plan that you can weather those some of what if scenarios to mitigate that risk after you close. If you close where your numbers are too skinny, and then something happens that is non-manageable, you can, you know, we're not the private sector with deep pockets, or that can immediately go out and do a funding call to get money to kind of come in. You're going to have to be able to weather those storms, and either shift where you're going to be investing your money, or make decisions where you're like, well, we were going to do that, you know, the boiler system, but okay, we're going to limp along with repair and maintenance, and we're going to forego that capital expenditure because we've got to move money over here. Because, and I think also another thing that I might add when you're looking at analyzing risk is ask yourself the question, because often we were doing this, are we doing this because it makes a sound business decision to acquire this property, or is mission driving it? And I find in this sector, a lot of times is that we're driven passionately by our mission, that sometimes we're blinded a little bit to our decision of just pure like business sense in that acquisition. And sometimes you've got to pull yourself back in and find that alignment between what makes sense financially for your organization, but is still in line also with your mission too. So sometimes I find we get clouded a little bit, but then it's good to have a team around you that can ground you as well. And hopefully as people's organizations grow, you'll have that team around you. But sometimes, I don't know, Sean and Josh, I mean, there's points at times where it was just me, right? So, and you're just pulling resources and connections and your peer network. And sometimes it can be very difficult, but it's okay to take a pause, pull in, whether it's in your own team or outside, and find that balance. Because sometimes if you purely go down mission, you could have long-term repercussions on that if you're not kind of thinking up of the sound business aspects of feasibility up front as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tiffany. And Sean, we'll get to you. And I wonder if you can also speak to the question of, I don't know if you were already going to, but what vacancy loss looked like for your buildings in the first couple of years, if it was higher than you expected, and how you managed those.
So many great points here. And certainly folks, if you're newer in this journey and you have questions, toss it in, because I think the three of us are kind of just catching up and sharing ideas with each other too. So if this isn't what's useful for you, then let us know, because I would love to just keep hearing Joshua and Tiffany share all their experience as well. To Tiffany's point about, like, even though it's a community organization and we're all working with big governance models and, you know, lots of other folks around us, it can be pretty lonely. Like, there are times that you're the one reading all the legal documents that I spent so many months just staring at. We put in our offer February of 2022. February 28th, 2022. And in March started the most aggressive interest rate increase campaign in like 40 years. And so we got to ride like that whole process. And so the amount of times I would refresh Market Watch each day to just terrifyingly look at the interest rate, like it can definitely feel really lonely. And so, like, I think also for yourselves, and this is like Joshua's point around the 10-year period, is like eventually you may want to change in your life, and that's okay. What happens to your CLT if you're gone? Like maybe you and the initial board are volunteering a lot of your time. Maybe you got a CMHC grant because there's a lot of money flowing around the affordable housing space. There may be less so after a change in government, and there may be less energy for whatever the next board is taking care of the organization. Like, can you keep it going? And even spending a bit of time thinking about, not necessarily deeply planning for worst case scenarios, but say everyone is getting a little tired, but you have that property, you want to make sure it's safe. Like, is there a charitable partner in town who you'd feel comfortable, kind of having that conversation about amalgamating with in the future, or donating your property to make sure that the mission is still safe, even if the organization's not. Ultimately, it's the impact we create that's the most important thing, not the organization that holds it. So have that conversation, feel what is right for you and the folks working with you. We're all doing this because we're entrepreneurial people to a certain degree, and like we stubbornly believe that we can make things a little bit better for folks around us. And that does sometimes get us in those problems that Tiffany was mentioning around getting too excited about a project. There's one initiative that I'm part of right now where we're trying to raise money to buy an old shopping plaza, tear it down, get it all ready for development with site servicing, subdivide it, and then sell individual parcels at cost to nonprofits. So it takes away a lot of the development risk for the nonprofit. They'll have 1 to 2 years to get prepared to build. There's a site we're looking at, and we're all very excited. There's some financial commitments that have come in as well, but we're going to actually spend one of our next board meetings trying to come up with a list of all the potential things that could go wrong, weighting them, trying to figure out what we do if some of those things happen as well. So that we're all being really intentional and kind of creating that space for us to think about the worst case scenarios as well, and not just to push forward as the entrepreneurs that we are. In terms of vacancy, we saw a higher vacancy or higher turnover in the first 2 years than we thought we would. I think some of that is the market's really wacky right now, and there's people who are trying to get out of apartments when they can and move into other spots to buy a home. We're kind of in our market range is more in like the $1,000 to $1,425, $1,500 a month is our affordability range. So these are our working folks who may have some different options or availability as well. We think of someone working full-time minimum wage up to about like $20 an hour is who we're primarily trying to support. But the market's also so tight that we're often filling the unit the next day or the next week. So the turnover hasn't really impacted us in terms of the actual vacancy loss all that much, maybe a little bit. The other piece is that, for your organization, you have to make the decision as to whether you're going to have 100% affordable units or if it's some sort of mix. So we did look at a lodging house. We had a purchase agreement on it. Ultimately, there was environmental site contamination, which is why we didn't purchase it. We'd have to spend a lot of money on monitoring and potential remediation for a fairly small site. And that one would have been 100% affordable and like Ontario Works welfare level affordability. The property that we ultimately purchased had a mix of rents. And I think a lot of us, as we're purchasing market rate properties, that's what we're going to see. Because landlords are putting so much pressure on rents within buildings that you're going to buy a building where there's someone already paying $2,000 a month. Because the financials are so tight, unless you have government or foundation support, you're probably not going to be in a position where you can bring those rents down. So you're going to have a percentage of your units that are at market and then a percentage that are affordable. So the key tool for most of us, not all of us, but for those of us who are kind of outside of Toronto and BC in these areas where there's more government support is CMHC MLI Select. And Joshua and Tiffany, maybe you folks use those tools too. But with MLI Select, you choose the units that you're going to designate as affordable. So for us, we have 60% of our units designated as affordable. When they turn over, there's vacancy control as well. So if someone's paying $1,200 a month for the previous tenant, the next tenant's paying $1,200 a month as well. So we can model that in where every year it's going up by the provincial guideline. Currently, that's 2.5%. And we then connect that to our inflation rate as well in our model. So our expenses also go up by 2.5%. that kind of keeps it matched. But for the 40% that aren't, we don't bring it up to full market, but we have a lower market rate that we want to bring those units up to. And that's how we're ultimately able to pay back our charitable foundations, by increasing rents a little bit to roll the principal into the mortgage when we refinance in year 11 after our 10-year term. So I'd be happy if folks are interested to share a financial model like offline and see like how we're planning to do this. So we assume that 5% of our units turn over each year. That's quite a bit lower than what we've actually been experiencing. And that the max attainable market rent increases by 5% each year. It's lower than what we've seen in recent years, but it's got to slow down eventually. So then there's some level of increase there as well. So all that kind of balances itself out, but making sure that you're including in your pro formas both a reasonable level of rent increases and operational expense inflation as well, probably connecting those two, and that any other assumptions you have in there are really clearly laid out. So for us, when we bring this to a potential foundation investor or to like an institutional partner like New Market Funds, to the municipality or foundation, they can clearly see what assumptions are underlying our pro forma. We can also bring them, and we have, to nonprofit and charity folks who have a lot more experience operating affordable housing than us, and to developers as well, and say, where are we right, where are we wrong. We can look at market reports from CBRE and from Bank of Canada and others to see, how do we fit within here? And then to Tiffany's point, how do we play with some of this? So if vacancy increased 2 or 3 times, how would that impact our model? If interest rates, for us, we have a 50-year time horizon in our pro forma, just so we can see the full length of the mortgage. When we refinance after 10 years, we assume that interest rates go up by a full 1%. So, maybe not the worst case scenario of what could happen, but at least a less good scenario of what would happen when we refinance as well. So those are some of the pieces that we think about. And then for our vacancy rate, it just hasn't been an issue because unfortunately people have nowhere to go. So as soon as someone moves out, we're having another tenant move in. Hopefully that'll become more of a problem for us and others as new supply comes online and the housing market stabilizes.
Great, thank you, Sean. I wanted to see, and we're not getting a lot of questions from our lovely attendees. I wonder if anyone else wanted to speak up, and even if you don't have a specific question, maybe share the angle that you're coming at acquisition from, your circumstance, and maybe our panel can share some thoughts they have on next steps for you, or approaches that you might take. Anyone in the audience want to share where they're at? I also know that when the sun goes down, it feels like bedtime, so it's all right if your brains are not firing on all cylinders tonight. I'll let that. Oh yeah, Dominique, go ahead.
So I just wanted to jump in with a question that is just that, we're a small neighborhood. We map the neighborhood. We, we have our eye on certain apartments that would be great to get. And then you get what you can, you're looking and I think about failed acquisitions, and, I think the failed acquisition is actually like not necessarily when you've gone through the due diligence period and find that there's something wrong. To me, that's not a failure per se. So Josh, advice, like, don't fall in love with the building. It's, but you get the building, this is the building, and then I have this haunted fear that then the next one is going to be like amazing. And then we won't have any funding. Like, this is just, because it's so clear to us it's so small and it's easy to map, and we're like waiting on certain buildings, but you can't wait forever. And you know, the just that you've gone and gotten this building, and then suddenly this would have been so much better. I guess that's just buyer's remorse, or but I wonder about balancing that long-term planning with opportunity, you know.
So we maintain a database of every building in the neighborhood that is a multi-unit rental property. We know which ones are rooming houses, which ones, who owns what. We know the tower rentals, the sites that are better for development, worse for development, the sites that have code compliance. We've mapped that out. So when funding's available, or when we have a line, or like we have our sites on funding, then we go and look at that list. We used to go and talk to landlords ourselves, and like this, like, which we would take the approach you would take. Like, we really like that building, we're like obsessed with that one. Now what we do is we have the list and we share it with our realtor. We don't actually talk to any landlords anymore, or like go and do any direct engagement with landlords. Our realtor does. He speaks realtor, or he speaks landlord. I don't speak landlord. And so he'll call all the landlords and see who's interested in selling in any particular moment where we're able to act, and then put a list together, and we'll meet with him and talk about those buildings. Like, what are the things that each of them might offer? We look at the information we have from our database and say, oh, we know this or that. We try to take we're at the stage now where we try to take as much of an objective perspective as we can. Like, we look across multiple opportunities. So yes, of course, like Celia recently went through this process with me. We were like, what's available? It happened to be a bad moment. Like, a lot of the landlords, the city put out a funding call in August, and all the landlords were off. And like, they want to sell their buildings all other times but August, because they're like at their cottage, or I don't know where they are, but they're not showing their buildings to sell them. So everything that was priorly available just was not. And so we had a smaller list, and it's like, yeah, we had to get over my like obsession with certain buildings, where I'm like, once there's money, we're gonna go for that building. It's like, no, what's here today? We have to be realistic. And how do the different options today map against each other? And at any given moment, you make the best decision you can. And sometimes you say, there's these three, I don't love any. Let's negotiate. Let's get into building and see it. Let's run the numbers. And so you start the process, and the process of doing that early due diligence, like pre-offer due diligence, I think like lets you know more. And then maybe you do an offer and you start to do some early diligence with an engineer, and you learn more, and you stay really cautious. And I think if you have money, be as cautious as you possibly can, because you can always turn and find another building. Like, you don't want to buy a building you're not going to be able to fulfill your mandate with. And we've recently realized that the buildings that are harder to manage because they're in worse state of repair and we're not able to repair, we're more likely to have tenants who fail, like whose tenancies fail. Like, they are unhappy in the home, it's not meeting their needs. There's kind of a vibe in a building that's not in a good state of repair that can impact the relationship between people, the relationship between tenants and the housing staff. And so you're more likely to have unsuccessful tenancies, which is the opposite of what we want, right? So like, we also, like, if we're only going to be able to act when there's money, and there's only money from time to time, we better buy good buildings, so that like we have the best chance of people living good lives in those buildings. It's just like, and we got to kind of be real about that.
Yeah, I would just echo, never fall in love with a piece of real estate, right? Especially from a community land trust perspective, you're looking at holding these in perpetuity, right? So like, applying like, what is the best acquisition? Any acquisition is a good acquisition, right? So don't fall in love with it. Look at it for what it actually means for your organization and for that long-term benefit. So yeah, I think I was taught, like, when I first entered the industry, like 25 years ago, that was one of the first lessons, right? Because I would talk about how great a property was, and you get passionate about it. And it was like, never fall in love with a property. It'll blind you with some of your decision making. So, but yeah. There's always another opportunity out there, but I think like also in our sector, we also get trapped up with those funding calls. Oh, there's an opportunity for money, right? And so like once again, going back to that thing, and even Sean, you spoke about it, and I did as well, is that, you know, what makes sense for the acquisition and your long-term position of owning that asset, and what your mission is, and finding that good balance.
It's so hard though. Like you see a property and you tour it for a bit, or like you start looking at it and talking about it. Like we're probably not gonna be able to buy this 80 unit property I've been looking at, and it has 2-bedroom rents for less than $900 a month that I can walk to from downtown Kitchener in 10 minutes. It's ridiculous that this property will be lost. But hey, like they're all gonna be evicted. Some of them become homeless. This is how the world works, and it's terrible. And no amount of me forcing us into like a really awful financial position is going to be able to save that. It's just brutal, and it's something that we're going to have to use as energy to keep us pissed off and working and finding it like an answer to this stuff, because there's like it shouldn't happen, and it's so easy to fix this. This is not a hard problem. We can actually you know, we've modeled it out that 10 years, 20 years tops, we can give the municipality back their money, often with interest. We don't even need a grant. Just loan us the money cheaply, probably at the rate you're getting it from the bond market, and we'll give you your money back, and we'll save all these people's homes. So yeah, like I'm deeply attached to this site, but like it won't work. And that's super hard. And it's really hard too when you have community folks like, so Acorn has been fighting this one landlord in the region for 2 years now. They've taken them to the tribunal. They've been in the front page of our newspaper, The Record, a few times. It's finally for sale. They came and said, Sean, can you help us? Can you save this building? It's way too much money. It's in like, he's jacked up the rents on half of them, so it wouldn't qualify for MLI Select. So we'd be paying really high rents to save a small number of affordable units. And you know, there's another one like this too, where the building had already been approved for demolition and turning into high-end condos. At that point, the land is worth just so much money. Like there's just no possible way that we could save it. So those ones get really hard too, especially when you have like community activists who you trust and support, and who like went out on a limb to try and like, you know, like we like your organization. We would feel good about the end of this campaign being you owning it, and you have to say no. Like that's super hard. We had another situation like that where it was a bit of a co-living space. It was like a Christian commune that bought this 18 unit property 40 years ago. And over time, all the owners kind of transitioned out and new people came in, but the rents were always just crazy cheap, like 3-bedroom apartments in a good spot for less than $600 a month. The mortgage was paid off. They didn't need it. They would send around a hat for collections to people when like when the roof needs to be fixed. Like super not sustainable in any corporate way, but like they made it work and it was awesome. And now the folks are in their, like the original owners are in their 80s, and they want to sell and donate the money to causes they care about and take care of their family. They came to us. The tenants approached us to see if we could buy it. We started talking to the realtor and the owner. Like, this is exactly the type of thing that we want, right? Like cool, wacky owners who've had it a long time. Tenants like want this to be saved. They love their community that they're part of. Unfortunately, the Residential Tenancies Act says that even when your landlord's cool and community minded, you can't increase your rents by that much. So when they approached us, the tenant said, like, some of us are paying $300 a month for a 2-bedroom. We know that's not feasible. Like, we can't even pay our own maintenance costs without passing the hat around. We want to bring our rents up to say like 700, and that's affordable for all of us here. None of us are OW or ODSP. We've just had really cheap rents. But there was no legal way for us to do that. So the only way would have been for the current landlord and the tenants to agree to an illegal rent increase and keep it in place for 1 year, and then it would become legal, because otherwise the bank won't approve the mortgage, because they know that the next day after closing, the tenants would be justified in refusing to pay that higher rent that our mortgage was based on. So unfortunately, the selling owners wanted to get their money out more quickly, and there's just no way that we can make the math work. And again, like, we got to know some of the tenants, we got to know the property, we got to know the backstory, and thought about like just how much this aligned with every little thing we've been trying to do and been talking about for years. And it was sold to someone who offered them all $7,000 to get out. So this is why we keep doing this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are all really difficult when it doesn't work out. But I guess you learn more through each of these experiences about which kinds of projects will and won't work, and you can bring that to the next one, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you have a responsibility to the tenants that you are housing too, right? Like you're taking a chance with their homes when you try and buy something else that may not be the right fit.
Yeah, absolutely. Still not hearing much from our lovely attendees. We're getting towards the end of our time here. I wonder if anyone wanted to share any last thoughts or questions before we kind of go to maybe any closing remarks we have from our panel. Any questions at all? I have one that I think kind of ties into what Dominique talked about in the webinar last week, which is, what do boards need to know to go through the acquisition process? But, since you're all staff with organizations, how should CLT staff support the board and other, pieces of your governance structure to do what they need to do throughout the acquisition process?
I can start. Make sense? So when our board is made up of community members who some of have lived experience or tenants, either in our buildings or other social housing or low-income rental housing, but also just community members, some of whom may or may not have technical experience with things like real estate or acquisition. So we actually have intentionally set up some infrastructure to provide some governance support around advising or making decisions around complex real estate situations. So, not everything that comes to a community land trust board is about real estate. Sometimes it's about our values, our plans, our intentions, our priorities, how we want to work together, how we want to make decisions, our budgets. But when we get into the detailed real estate discussions, it does get technical, and it does require often a certain level of competency with dealing with complex considerations that in my role have taken me 5, 6, 7 years to comprehend, to the point where I feel more confident in my decisions. So it's really hard to expect that a community member joins a board, maybe takes a acquisition 101 or affordable housing 101 and then feels fully confident in participating in a decision around we should or we shouldn't buy this building based on all the information staff have presented. So before something comes to a board, our best practice, and we don't always have the time to do it, but when we do have the time to do it, is that we bring it first to an acquisition committee. Our acquisition committee are community members and volunteers from the Toronto that have experience in real estate, legal, finance, who volunteer to sit and review staff's work and consultants' work and provide advice to the board. So they actually will review that work, ask more detailed questions, testing the staff's work, maybe asking questions around risk, making suggestions, and then they'll write a memo to the board so that the community-based board can receive advice from other community members who have other experience. It means that we can have the lived experience and values-oriented experience on our board while also getting the support of people with more technical expertise and not just stacking the board with lawyers and real estate people. So that's one thing that I think has helped, is that the community members aren't doing the analysis alone or only with the support of staff, but others. In addition, we try to do relatively detailed presentations. Sometimes I feel bad to have to share so much technical things, but I do my best to explain, this is the building, this is what we know about it. These are the reports we've done. This is what we've learned from the reports. These are how the reports change how we think the business plan is going to work. This is what that means for the long term. This is the lender. This is what they're offering. This is what it means. So we try to go through all the pieces step by step in the presentation. We provide a report in advance of the board meeting, but we present the report verbally with images on a slide deck as well, because we know that some board members want to read it in advance and other board members need to hear it and talk about it to absorb it. And then we have a conversation, and we try to invite people to ask any question, even if it's that classic thing. There's no dumb questions. In fact, dumb questions are the best questions because they're the ones everyone else is thinking, but just haven't said yet. And it's worth actually reiterating some basic things, and the basic things are important. And then we try to make decisions by consensus. So if we can't, sometimes we don't make a decision on time. We have to set up another meeting or a follow-up meeting or delegate the decision to other people. One thing that I've found is really important for staff to metabolize and for boards to be willing to request or require is that if the board does not feel comfortable moving forward on something related to an acquisition that has a high future stake or risk to the organization, that staff need to be willing to support a process to get the board to a place where they can make a decision. And that might mean not making a decision that day and developing out a process to get there, to get to a decision. And it's like, I think in community governance, we need to be really mindful of not forcing decisions on our community-based boards. Just because, real estate, it works with these fast timelines. We got to make the decision or everything's going to fall apart. We're going to lose it. We really have to be willing to slow down. We can't slow down just forever. We have to be like, well, that means we might meet tomorrow and keep talking, or I will prepare something, further information for the board and send it out, and then you vote online. But we have to be willing to pivot to another way of making the decision or to extending the process of consideration. Because if we do want community members to participate in governance, we have to be willing to work a bit differently than you might in just a strictly business transaction decision-making process.
Yeah, I'll just add to that because I think that that's what's unique in the community land trust space is that it is very much community-oriented governance versus a board that is put together with specific expertise, that where you might have this expertise to analyze large complex real estate transactions on your board. So the external committee is an excellent way to add that support for your board. I'd also even, and we've faced this as well, and why it's important, I think, to have that rapport and the constant reporting and the documentation of that reporting, both in the detailed and more the simple kind of presentation format, is that sometimes our transactions, because they'll take a long time, is that we've actually had boards turn over. And then you end up starting over again. So as staff members, patience. And that you might have to just feel like you're going all the way back to the beginning again, but also remembering those are community members that are new to the board, and they're the ones that might be there at the final decision making, and they deserve the same opportunity that other board members that had 2 years of history on a real estate transaction. So sometimes you just need to add in that into your own patience and approach as you're dealing with governance. And we're also looking at too, internally discussing at a staff level right now of putting a policy in place with regards to acquisition as well, that would guide us a little bit more on kind of our strategic direction of moving forward into kind of our next phase of acquisitions. In some of our opportunities for acquisitions as well, especially when we look forward down into if any have redevelopment potential, is that they could also trigger a disposition. So an acquisition and a disposition policy, and that might not mean that we're selling the land, but maybe we are ourselves doing, we've done this with when we've had mixed use, where we've sold the retail component. So we've signed on 99-year leases. So we're actually looking to, because we might have to bring in capital funding. So the capital markets kind of coming in, and they're going to want an ownership stake in that. So it's not about selling off the land. It's about it's a title registration of what would trigger a disposition, but you would still own the underlying land on there. So we're actually looking at developing that ourselves and just kind of batting it around the table right now. But really kind of want to put that forward in kind of a guiding document for staff so that it's clear between us and our mandate as staff and what our board expects of us as well, so that there is that commonality of direction and what needs to be done. So when we make those presentations to the board, we can say we're following this, right?
Some advice I got from Joshua years ago, and I don't know if he would even remember giving it, but was just get started. And at the time we were talking about governance of CLTs. He said, you know, you're not going to get something perfect on day one, but you have to at least get started, or else you won't get to day 1,000. And I think that's really, really good advice that, you know, especially if you're a newer CLT just getting started here, it may really just be your board, right? Like you may not have this huge organization. You may all be volunteers. You may not have a ton of members. So it's going to be really scrappy. And then as you start to grow, you have more staff, you know, you have more community members and tenant members participating, and there's board turnover, then you'll start slowly making your own board policies and internal policies with time. You know, when we first started, we naively thought that we could, at least in some way, involve all of our members in every acquisition by kind of letting them sign off on us moving ahead. And that's just not practical, and potentially it's not legal. You know, and then we thought, you know, with our board, that it would be, again, like a really engaged process throughout the whole time. And then much like how Joshua described it, like we're now looking at establishing a separate committee, because a lot among our members, we have engineers and architects and lawyers and landscape architects, builders, all these great skills. And we don't want to just flood our board with that. Like we want to make sure that there's a great mix of experiences on the board, but we also need those too. I'm on the board of the Canadian Cooperative Investment Fund. If you're a co-op and looking for funding, that's one source to look for. And the way that CCIF is structured is that as a board member, I never actually see any of the deals that we finance. So like I'll get updates after the fact, but we have a separate fund manager and we have a separate advisory committee that looks at all that. And then for us, we focus more on the fund itself and the values, the goals, the objectives. So that's not exactly, I think, what any of us have said in terms of the CLT approach, but thinking about, you know, if you do really want the board to be values driven and have the time to focus on governance and strategy, it also means taking out some of those other pieces and give them the time and the space for doing that. We're now creating a more in-depth board calendar that includes regular risk assessments and strategic assessments as well. So the board's providing that clear guidance, but then not having to get us into the operating stuff that used to. Like when we first started, because we weren't earning any money, the board approved every single expense that we had because it was always their money effectively that we were spending. It was member money. So we really locked it down. And of course, that's not practical when, you know, we're now, even as a small organization, making $1 million a year and spending it most of it out the door to pay other people in expenses. So, you know, you'll get there, and it will just take some time as you go forward. I think the big thing is to, especially with community boards, is to make really intentional processes and to make the space for people who maybe feel like they're not the experts in the room to raise concerns and to object if they feel that either they don't know enough or they're concerned about something going forward. You know, at this point, you know, I wrote the business plan. I've been around the longest. We've had now half of the board members turned over at our spring AGM, the first time we've had new board members coming in. So as organizations go forward, there's that other kind of founder issue that you get, or like the long-term staff member issue, where, you know, it almost starts to look more like a corporation or an enterprise with then some supporting volunteer members. So we have to really make sure that we're centering the idea that no, the board is in charge, and we're going to slow the processes down. We're going to actually suggest to you, here are some potential concerns that you may have. Here's the process for raising concerns, the risk that you personally have if you approve something, and then we're not like, you're on the hook for environmental damage. Like, you know that personally you could be on the hook for that. So let's slow down. Let's think about these issues and make the space for people to raise those concerns.
Amazing. And I guess we'll just go to Josh for last thoughts before we end.
Oh, this is not the most inspiring. When we're, to Tiffany's point, like your boards do change over time. And sometimes like, especially the community organizations like ours, like it may take like, you may be working on a set of related projects for a decade. And so there's been 100 board members over a decade, maybe, or, and there's 2 people who were there at the beginning, still at the end, because you have to pass the torch over time, right? But it's important that the board isn't like undulating between agendas, right? Like there has to be some consistency and like respect to the prior decisions. Of course, like any board can make a new decision, but it's, I think, our responsibility as staff or core volunteers to ensure that there's a good documentation of the set of decisions that have led to a project being implemented. If you spent 7 years or 5 years trying to get to a point where this project is going to happen, and you happen to the night that that decision needs to get made, there's a board that isn't aware of that history and is like, we're not that interested in this. It's like, what do you mean? We've been working for 7 years. We made 24 decisions to get us here. That's actually like, I think, something that we can try to mitigate. I don't think it's not an impossible thing to happen. It can totally happen because new people at the table who maybe don't have that understanding of how we've gotten where we've gotten have the right and have, based on how they have available, maybe like that. There's other more important projects in the community right now. So I think it's important that we maintain like a good documentation and make it very available to board members at all times. Like the decisions that have been made by this community board, which you now are a representative of, but to get us to this project. And so when we're making a decision on that project, we need to be mindful of that and try to respect that history of decisions that have gotten here. Of course, doesn't mean we make a bad decision today because we made a decision yesterday, but it means we want to try to, as a whole, like respect the momentum that's being built over time by the community in this effort. But if we don't share that information, then it's not available to them. And so it's really easy to forget, like just having them in minutes isn't enough because no one's going to go back and read 3 years of minutes. So, yeah, just leave people with that. Like it takes a long time to get these projects done. It really takes a long time. And so keeping good track and sharing with everybody what it's taken to get where you are really helps with those next steps to like know that whether you should or shouldn't move forward on something or, how to, to take that into consideration when you're making decisions to move forward.
I think that's a great thought to end on. Thank you so much, Josh, Sean, and Tiffany for your time and for sharing your knowledge and experiences with all of us. Thanks everyone else for spending your evenings with us or late afternoons if you're in BC or on the West Coast. And I'll send the slides tomorrow. And stay tuned because we have a number of other resources related to acquisition coming out soon. So if you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, if you're not already a member, you should definitely do that at communityland.ca. All right. Thank you all. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.